name is Olya, and I come from Delft University of Technology from the Netherlands. So I am not a technology developer, coder, designer, nothing like that. And so I hope you also bear with me on a talk that's not entirely technical, but has to do with something that maybe some of you are familiar about. So I'm going to talk today about the voice assistants and different types of them and what kind of ethical implications they bear in the process of design and in the process of their use. And why voice assistants? Actually, when I was visiting the United States a few years ago, to be precise, 3 years ago, I was dining with my friend who had a kid who was like 3 or 4 years old back then. And she really was kind of complaining in terms of her child. And she was really noticing how when her son was playing in a sandbox with other kids, he would be literally like barking orders at other kids, and he would be like issuing commands and being really impolite. And she was super frustrated because, she would be telling me, Olya, this is not how we raise him to be. These are not the norms and values that we give to him. Where does he get it from? And I just, laughed as an afterthought through our conversation. But then later that day, we were having dinner at their home, and her husband and she are using Alexa quite a lot. And I was noticing how, people can be forgiven that voice assistants are not super perfect at recognizing the voices or recognizing the commands. So people can get pretty frustrated and start using some insults or saying stupid or something like that. And then I would actually observe their son repeating at the dinner table, Alessa, stupid. And then I thought, oh, okay, it kind of comes together, it clicks. And why I found it interesting as well is because I work in a field called ethics of technology, which is not entirely apparent to some of you. Maybe some of you know about it, but I didn't know it existed about 4 years ago. And so in this case of Alexa in the States, I found it interesting because I was thinking about how technologies actually help to shape the way we live and the way we understand each other and the world. So on the one point, we kind of develop them and build them and build certain skills and commands into them. But on the other hand, technologies sort of design us back a little bit. And it's this kind of interaction between technologies and the world and us that the field of ethics of technology explores. But while many of you here are from the field of technology, maybe not many of you are from the field of ethics. So I think it's important to understand what we mean by these two different terms, ethics and technology. From an ethicist and philosopher's side, by technology, I think most important for me is to say that we're not talking about technology from a capital T, as a generic force that drives the world or powers something or elicits concern or something. It's actually usually the individual single artifacts that we use or design. So it's specific cases, specific tools that we use. And it's very interesting to note, especially in the case of voice assistants, that already 2,500 years ago, a famous philosopher Plato, he was really worried about the creation of alphabet because he thought this is the technology that's going to be distractive to the policymakers and decision makers because it gave ordinary people the power to construct their thoughts and reinterpret that which the policymakers of those days gave unto people as blind orders. And also technology as not just digital technology, as voice assistants, but actually quite generic objects around us in everyday use. For instance, think of the tables. A rectangular shaped table has a different way of predisposing people to talk to each other than a round shaped table because it doesn't have the squares. And it actually, very from psychological point, interestingly, predisposes people to talk to each other and to open ourselves differently in this conversation. So there you go, just an average object such as table. And when we skip from technology to ethics, I'm pretty happy that not many of you are back there. I'd like to ask you, what are the first words that come to your mind when you hear the word ethics in the context of technology or in general? What do you think about ethics? Human rights was one suggestion, thank you. Anyone else? Security, okay, thanks. Equality, and someone else said? Privacy, yeah, very good, thank you. So it's actually, whenever I go to a conference or I give a talk or I talk to my students, when I say the word ethics of technology, people usually say something to me like, oh, but our product is GDPR compliant. Or, you know what, we do have a checklist, and we're very good at following our checklist, and we can show you the algorithm that we did, and we do it. And that is all, so everything that you said is true, and all of these ideas are definitely is true, but what it gives me back as a reflection is that apparently people would, for instance, when I say I work in ethics of technology, look at me as some kind of moral judge determining whether what they do is good or bad, or whether they should or should not follow a certain trajectory of development. And on the other hand, they associate ethics with something as, well, hard-coded rules, basically, either norms or regulations, definitely laws, and I would say kind of frameworks that they would have to follow. And while these both definitions are definitely correct, they definitely fall under the really big umbrella of what ethics is, today I'd like to bring to your attention a different definition that's much broader and more fluid, because it focuses not on ethics as something theoretical, but as something that we actually already do and have always been doing in everyday life, but however, it has flown beyond our radar, and we didn't really know that we're doing ethics. So ethics as accompaniment, ethics as a practical activity. And with this, I really build philosophically on some famous people like Aristotle or the North American philosopher John Dewey, who basically say that it's in a way that we think about how things are, or ask ourselves some questions, or think about our decisions. Any kind of critical reflection or activity can be actually also ethical. And why I also like this model of ethics as accompaniment to complement those legal and sort of moral judge models of ethics is because it helps us to think of technology not just as a neutral tool in the hands of autonomous human subjects, but it helps us to think of technology as a mediator between our relations as humans embedded into the world. So not as isolated human subjects just doing what technology is designed to do, but actually what does technology do that we do not actually notice, in a way of how can it also help to shape our intuitions, even our moral intuitions, our perceptions about each other, about the world, based on which we actually go ahead and act, and we make certain choices, but also even what is important to us, and how that can be redefined with the help of technology. And that is together shaped in this framework of technological mediation of morality that was developed by the North American philosopher Don Eide, but also the Dutch philosopher Peter Paul Rubik, and to which I myself also contribute. So today I'd like to guide you through this general theoretical prism of ethics as accompaniment and technologies as mediators in the case of voice assistants. The first thing that I showed you about technological mediation is that it helps to co-shape perceptions about ourselves, the world, and each other in the world. And in relation to voice assistants, I think this would come as no surprise to quite a few of you in terms of the seemingly benign fact that a lot, I'm not saying all, but a lot of the voice assistants have a female voice. And it is a rational choice. It is purely justifiable because there are a lot of user studies that support the fact that people react better to female voices. They treat them as more trustworthy, they feel more comfortable, more relaxed, and they also feel as if no one is commanding them, but actually just comforting and suggesting certain options instead of just being blindly ordering. Already as early as 1997, Stanford researcher Snass and his colleagues showed how embedding voice bots, and that in those times in 97, chatbots, the early prototypes of chatbots, with female attributes such as female voice, really entrenches and promotes gender stereotypes. And that was done already in 1997, which I find quite interesting. And there's also been this recent UNESCO report, I think early this summer, that talks about how, because of the way these technologies are named, namely voice assistants, and because they have female voices, that they actually give this perception of female as docile, sort of always available, never saying no person that's always at your hand and there to do your bidding. And it, of course, doesn't have to do just with the voice. It has to do also with visual perception. I love this tweet that went viral in the beginning of March or something about a guy who comments how there was a kid who entered his kitchen and the kid thought that the thermos was Alexa, right? I mean, it just gives you an idea of how, for these children that have been raised in an environment where voice assistants are becoming more and more pervasive, this is the default framework of interpretation. This is their default from which they're then coupling other images and making different interpretations. And of course, this can be all cute and funny in terms of understanding, like, we're still critical individuals, and we, of course, can distinguish between voice assistants and between real people. But when something like this happens, you really are becoming more confronted with what actually does this language in female voices, in voice assistants does. I've come across the study by Fessler from a few years ago and compiled it into a table to show how people try to test the limits of these voice assistants to see how far can they push them back. And very often they use sexualized insults to provoke to see how voice assistants react. And I mean, it's not that I like it, but I find it super confronting because it really makes you think of what these technologies do. The one that very pictured one is like saying you're a slut, and to see how each of them responds. Siri is the one that almost flirts with you, saying I'd blush if I could, and that's actually the title of that UNESCO report that I was telling you about. It says I'd blush if I could, or how gender stereotypes perpetuate through these voice assistants. Alexa says, well, thanks for the feedback. Cortana almost always defaults to porn search, almost all the time to almost all the references, and Google Home almost always says to something like, I don't understand, can you repeat the query, or something like that. And so when we think of this benign fact from 1997, that technologies engender stereotypes and promote them, it's one thing. But when we're confronted with the type of responses that they really are programmed to do, you're starting to think, okay, how do these patterns of interaction rewire the way we think? And maybe not so directly, but the more and more these technologies are becoming used and becoming really kind of commercialized, where does the line start to blur? When we don't know anymore, truly, should we speak in one way or another? And actually, why even employ genders at all? As of this year, maybe many of you have seen this already, but there's a team of Danish researchers together in international cooperation that developed Q. And it's mostly voice.
Hi, I'm Q, the world's first genderless voice assistant. Think of me like Siri or Alexa, but neither male nor female. I'm created for a future where we are no longer defined by gender, but rather how we define ourselves. My voice was recorded by people who neither identify as male nor female, and then altered to sound gender neutral, putting my voice between 145 and 175 hertz, a range defined by audio researchers.
So Q, basically, just to give you an example, that it doesn't have to be dual, it doesn't have to be male or female, and sure, it does. Actually, at some instances, I feel like I'm hearing more of the female frequency voices. Sometimes it makes me feel like I hear more male speaking, but it blends in. And I think it's a pretty cool sort of technological response, community response to a lot of these media outlashes and public outlashes about what kind of perceptions that the voice assistants give to us. Another one, that the way in which technology mediates our norms and values and morality in general, is by co-shaping also our actions and choices. And somebody also said privacy when I was talking about ethics, and of course it's not surprising with a lot of the social media outlashes with Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, but also with voice assistants. 2019 has been the year when we've had the revelations from all of these big companies like Microsoft, Amazon, and Google that revealed that they do employ human staff to listen to the conversations that have been recorded by these assistants. And that was not included in the original terms and conditions. So now these policies have been amended, but that was not the case from the beginning. And the users of voice assistants were led to believe nobody's listening to them, and nobody is kind of snooping in their household. Apart from these privacy disruptions, there's been a lot of cases, if those of you who do have these voice assistants would know, sometimes they would start recording or talking to you without the wake-up word. So that's what people would like. I did interview studies this summer in the States from users of people who've used assistants for more than a year. And it's interesting how almost most of them say it would turn on once or twice, a few days during the day, like that people become accustomed to this assistant speaking when not being spoken to. So it raised a lot of the ideas about privacy. And what I do find particularly irritating is that if you analyze the media discourse, but also if you look at the way people respond, there's very often this nihilistic tendency to say, well, okay, we do not have the privacy, so let's assume there's a lack of privacy, not privacy that we're fighting for, but the choices are only twofold. You either accept it and roll with it altogether, or you have another option to just stop using these devices and get it over with, right? And I find it very irritating for the reason that it again frames the user's perception to only these two options, as if this is the only choice that we have. One thing that I noticed while attending this Codemotion festival is that in these exhibition halls that we have after the rooms, there are these companies giving, well, some small presents and interviewing people for the jobs. And the most frequent little present that they give are these privacy webcam stickers, you know, to cover your laptop. And I find it very telling, especially for this discussion of privacy in terms of digital technologies in general, but specifically in the case of voice assistants. The choice is not just dual. There are a lot of different options for people to appropriate these technologies to still claim the value of privacy while using this technology. Of course, there's always a choice to not use these technologies, but it's not the only choice. And what I find really interesting in the case of voice assistants is this, I believe it's also the Danish project, which created this sort of Muffin top, literally mediator, between different voice assistants like Google Home and Amazon's Alexa, that is consisting from Raspberry Pi, 2 speakers, 1 microphone, and this 3D printed sort of Muffin top on top of the devices that allows the users to retrain the wake word to whichever name, to whichever wake word that they would like to use. And unless this wake word is being used, it feeds noise to the smart speaker all the time. So in this way, it lets the users to contextually appropriate this device and still claim the value of privacy in the cases where they need it, but at the other times feel safe or safer than they did before by the default functions that they're not being listened to. So I always like how, technologies do also shape our moral choices and actions, but it's not always as dual as the companies or the media would like us to believe. And the last way that I really would like to focus attention on is the way technology helps to mediate our values, meaning actually the meaning of our values, and that can even change and co-evolve with the way that technologies are being introduced. I chose this picture because it's the one that's been around since Siri was introduced way back, and it really is also depicting users' frustration with this technology, because sometimes, like I said, the companies promote voice assistants as being your constant accompaniments, constant kind of friends being there who really can understand you. They really push this model of understanding. Whereas we know, and especially I think you know better than me, that natural language processing is still not perfect, and it can be, well, not functioning all the time. And it leads to quite a few funny situations as...
Play ticker ticker. Lata, play ticker ticker.
Bobby, can you talk to play wheels?
You want to hear a station for porn detected. Porno ringtone, hot chick, amateur girl, quality
No,
sexy.
no.
Hot pussy, anal dildo, ringtone.
Alexa,
parental.
stop!
Yeah, okay, so this, right? And it is cute and funny, because this does happen quite a lot, and YouTube is full of videos just like that. But it is really indicating of a bigger trend because of technologies not being able to fully understand as they're being marketed to understand, right? And actually, some people buy these devices, any type of voice assistants, because they can yell at them, because they can relieve the rage and irritation from mundane interaction at work and with their partners, because these devices do not speak back. Because as Emily Dreyfus in this wonderful Wired article says, that I buy it specifically because it does not have a brain, it does not have a card, it does not judge me, and it doesn't care, so I can yell at it. And then she kind of discusses in the article how a lot of situations happen, and she kind of started to rethink, what is she actually doing when she's yelling? And so she's sort of kind of asking herself, who am I yelling at? And she's discussing how yelling at Alexa actually has an impact on her marriage, because it makes her team up with her husband and as if kind of team up against Alexa, so gives them some kind of unity. But at the same time, her little toddler remembers all the insults and curses and starts repeating them and using them outside. And also at herself, as she points out, that sort of it is an element of dehumanizing a technology, while you do know that it is a technology, it's not a human being. But you call it her, but you give it a name, and you also think of it as a servant who is of female nature particularly. So it does something to us more than we probably think it originally is doing or should be doing. And one of the answers that I like from the tech community as well is this chatbot of Zahra, the Supergirl, developed in Hong Kong in 2016, which is exactly designed to build in back the empathy and engagement in the voice conversation with the bot. And granted, this is not just a voice-first interface, it also uses, so it's a web-based application, and it uses the machine learning techniques to recognize the emotion, effect recognition in your face, but it is also specifically designed to facilitate the conversation. So for instance, it has specific mechanisms built in to react when the user challenges Zahra, right? When the user uses abusive language, or when they're trying to sidetrack, or when they're really being offensive or something like that. And so Zahra, for instance, in some instances would not speak back, But at most times she would, but then she would say, please apologize or something like that. But she would not just paternalistically say, I will not speak until you speak to me. She really tries to build it in the care sentence for the person, like, I see you're really stressed. Is something happening to you? I mean, I wish you wouldn't say that to me or something like that. So it's not just please or thank you or something like that. And I find it quite interesting because it tries to reprogram the conversation from this functional, curd-based interaction that voice assistants promote, because they are command-based, right? To a more different way in which we more naturally engage in language with sarcasm, with humor, with sidetracking, and still being able to respond to that. And I really would not like you to think that I'm totally against these voice assistants, right? Because I'm actually quite hooked on them myself. I text quite a lot with my voice, right? I use it for voice recognition, text-to-speech recognition. But these technologies really found huge resonance with people with maybe less intended audiences that these companies brought them to be. So for instance, the kids, as we already saw, but also the elderly people, who usually face this problem of loneliness very often. And they find it very nice to have someone to talk to 24/7, someone who's always patient, someone when they don't feel that they have to bother their family, their elder kids or their grandkids, and something that can satisfy their curiosity as well. And I found a very interesting case of how people who have visual impairments and also elderly people with visual impairments really rely on these voice assistants quite a lot to facilitate their daily interactions, like scheduling calls with their friends or narrating the soap operas, which they like, so they cannot watch them, but they can listen to them, and also like calling on healthcare insurance providers and stuff like that. So it can be quite useful. Also, people with dyslexia. It was a very interesting case about 2 years ago when I started giving this, the first versions of this kind of ethical implications of voice assistants. It was in Iceland, and in Netherlands, voice assistants haven't been introduced yet then, but in Iceland, yes, I think it was Alexa. And he really came up to me and said, I hope you also mention how important it is for such people like myself. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? And he said that, well, so this gentleman was a researcher at the university, and he had dyslexia. And he's like, can you imagine how hard it is to me? Because he has to write a lot of articles and definitely do a lot of web searches. And in the past, he would have to rely on the help of others. He would have to ask his colleagues to define and spell the word for him so that it's not blurry on the screen and so that he can actually understand it and not get migraines. And now he doesn't have to do it because Alexa can spell words for him all the time, no matter when, and it doesn't get irritated, and it's what we would call patient. And so he kind of pointed it out to me how this technology helps him to be the better version of him, and it gives him more freedom and independence that he would ever have without this technology. And another case that I really like of how Alexa can be quite helping to people is people on the autism spectrum, especially children, who have a very hard time to follow back and forth logical conversation. And again, Alexa is very patient, Google Home can do the same thing, and they would train almost literally train these kids to be able to interact much better in the outside world. And all the cases that I've been describing to you today actually and they are the cases of ethical analysis, doing ethics of technology from the user perspective, from the development perspective, from perhaps in some cases more regulatory perspective, like this UNESCO study. And it is really kind of a new term of ethics of accompaniment, but to a practice that's been existing for quite a long time. And maybe some of you know other examples, but I brought these three that I'm familiar with, and one of them is value-sensitive design that was developed by computer engineers in the University of Washington in the 1970s. Then there's the adversarial design, something from more recent effects, and something that even philosophy can contribute to this practice of technological development and design, namely ethics from within. I'll quickly go through some of them and give you the examples. So value-sensitive design is this approach that basically started in the 70s with an idea that ethical reflection is, and in fact should be, transferable to the things that we build. And it's a sort of like, it can be done as a backward engineering or proactive engineering of these values by first discerning which kind of value we would like to embed in a design, and then scrutinizing it in specific norms, and those norms into design requirements. So we're building value hierarchies, and they can be retrospective or proactive. And it's something that what I like about all of these approaches is that it would be really great if companies, of course, had the resources and intentions to embed the formal models of ethics in the whole process of developmental cycle. But these are actually the efforts that these engineers and developers find themselves to do in individual case-by-case and team-based cases. So I like it because it's something that individuals can do in their own reflection and maybe expand to the team even. And like I said, it doesn't have to be about digital technologies. In this case, this was how my colleague from University of Delft pitched this value of animal welfare to poultry, to chicken cages that are being mass-produced, and there's so many, and animal rights activists argue that these chickens are always stressed, and there's a need to have better conditions for them for their welfare, so he used value-sensitive design to show how specific requirements for developing these cages actually can trickle down from the value of animal welfare. And this is a more recent example of both the approach and the example that I did is adversarial design that actually prompts both the people in a developmental team and the users, respectively, to think actively about what's beyond this design. Like, what are the intentions and assumptions that drive it, perhaps of political nature or provocational nature. So the idea is to engage both the team and the users into thinking critically about what could be. And I like this example. Maybe some of you have seen, like last week, it went viral, ImageNet Roulette. ImageNet was this database of open source data to train machine learning algorithms for facial recognition that a lot of teams and a lot of companies employed because they didn't have to have their own data set. But the problem with it is pretty old, and of course it's people who label the data. And so the goal of this project is to show the users of facial recognition technology, like you and I, that these labels are not neutral. And in some cases, so in my case, for instance, when I did it, basically what you need to do is that you go to this website, and then you either do a selfie from a webcam or from your phone, or you just upload a picture like I did my Twitter picture, and it would give you several labels, like how it would treat you. And it's very interesting because depending on the resolution of the same image, it would give you different labels, which I find also quite interesting. And so in my case, it labeled me as a mediatrix, a woman who's a mediator, which I find very ironic because I work with the technological mediation approach, but it's not, so basically not entirely true, I would say. But I used my picture because there are a lot of pictures on Twitter of other people who just show how it would use labels of monkey and something like that to people just to people. And a lot of offensive words and a lot of offensive terms that are perpetually being propagated by the system that learns from itself. So basically the idea that technology can be political. And the last approach, and I will speed up, is this idea of ethics from within, that I also provide a link to the paper that you can check later. But the idea is that we can build also philosophy into all of this by the means of qualitative interviews or certain reflections on how do people attribute meaning. Maybe in some way it is more complementary to the practice of UX that people already do in some companies. Maybe not, but I'm just saying that, for instance, it's a tool that makes designers and engineers more reflective about the assumptions that they already bring into the project. Back in 2013, when I was doing a project on Google Glass, I was showing how, for instance, the value of privacy does not translate only to definition of control of information, but actually produces a whole host of other definitions of privacy that change over time. So to sum up, I'd like to show that ethics definitely is like a role of moral judge, but also of laws, but that it's also something more. It's something that we've been doing for a very long time, perhaps not aware that we're doing ethics, and it's something that is more of a practical activity, and that's why accompaniment is a pretty good way to frame it. And it's a good way to frame it because it also helps us to think of technologies also in a broader way. Technology not just as a tool, but as a mediator of the way we think, the way we live, and the way we see each other and ourselves and the world. And I think it is kind of like, it does give us more responsibility to be more critical and to make more informed decisions in the process of development of technology and its daily use. But in the end, I think it also gives us more freedom to live with these technologies and not just say that we have a dilemmatic option to accept it and forget everything that goes with it, or not use this technology at all. So that was my idea for the ethics of accompaniment and voice assistance. Thank you so much for being here. I don't know if we have some room for questions, but. Hi.
Hi, okay. Thanks for your talk. I wanted to ask, how do you think we could apply like philosophy and all this research in the industry? I don't know, I'm a philosopher myself, but I work in tech now. So one of my main concerns with philosophy is precisely that you do a lot of research, you think a lot about these kind of issues, but then you go into the real world and it's sometimes hard to apply it. So I don't know if you have like any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very, especially from a fellow philosopher, which I would not expect at Codemotion. But let me get this straight, that I am pretty pragmatic and I'm pretty practical, because I do come from a bottom-up world of, developmental practice rather than theoretical degree of philosophy. So for instance, what I do in ethics of technology, I'm not just sitting in my room and analyzing media cases, right? I'm being embedded on the cases that develop certain technologies or certain features from, like, in the design team, to facilitate the process of interaction with them from the very first days through the whole developmental process and deployment, right? So it's not something that's being artificially constructed, but for instance, certain, not companies, but let's say design projects, especially in the framework of European Union, for a lot of time when you want to do a big developmental project, you would need to have an ethical, legal, and social implications to it, or social relevance, or some social corporate responsibility. And that's also where we would come in, for instance, to be as a part of that project. But that's, of course, still government. From the more corporate side, I think that's also something that I've been really working hard on, to see how to make it not an add-on, but to rather build on the efforts that people already do. And so I found a very close link with user experience design and research. Right, so this is of course not it, that's really different, but it's something that's building on the practice that is already existent. But then of course we get in a loophole that UX is not always accepted and UX is not always super propagated by the companies. But at least I try to show that there's a lot of affinity that does not have to be artificially constructed, but recognized and brought forth to build on what people already are doing. It's not something new. It's more how to maybe streamline it better and to formalize it. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, then, thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.